Hi, in this video I'm going to go over the stories in the third volume of Thieves World, which is called Shadows of Sanctuary. The introduction story was written by Robert Lynn Asprin. It starts with Hakim the storyteller sitting in the Vulgar Unicorn listening for tales that he can use to ply his trade out in the bazaar. While he's sitting there, One Thumb walks in, and since One Thumb hasn't been seen in over a year, it makes Hakim curious. So he goes and talks to One Thumb, and he gets a little bit of info that kind of explains One Thumb's absence. Hakim also notes that something seems a little different about One Thumb. This brief story does provide a possible theory for One Thumb's disappearance. It also gives some information that I thought was going to lead to another story about a serial killer in this volume, but that never actually came to be. So I'm not sure why they put it in there. There's a bit about it, but it becomes a very minor plot point in another story. Because of the information that the introduction's giving, I'd probably rate it about a 7 out of 10. Vonda Ann McIntyre wrote the next story in the book. Science fiction fans may remember her name as the author of a novel called Dream Snake, which won the 1979 Nebula Award. I've never read that, but I did read a book of hers called The Moon and the Sun, which won the Nebula Award in 1997, and I really enjoyed that novel. It was basically about a mermaid that gets captured during the court of Louis XIV, and it's a very interesting novel. The story she wrote for Shadows of Sanctuary is called Looking for Satan, and it starts off with 4 people that have obviously never been to Sanctuary before wandering into Sanctuary looking for a friend of theirs. When they stop at the Vulgar Unicorn, they happen to run into Lythan the Magician, who at first is adversarial with them because of something one of them says to him, but then he decides to help them because he has an idea of how to figure out where the person they're looking for might actually be. The story has halfway decent dialogue in it, but there's just way too much of it. Maybe it's because the characters were so new to Sanctuary that they just had to do a lot of setup so that you would know who they were and that kind of thing, but it got boring after a while, and I really wasn't into the story that much. I also think the story ended in the wrong place. One specific point was mentioned a couple times in the last 10 pages, and it's like, I don't need the repetition. I got it the first time. I also thought the last 4 to 5 pages were completely unnecessary to the story and wouldn't lead to anything, and they didn't. The boredom factor and the drawn-out ending caused me to rate this one a 4 out of 10. Well-known science fiction and fantasy author C.J. Cherryh wrote the next story in the anthology. She won the Hugo Award for Down Below Station back in 1981, and she won another one for a novel called Cytine in 1988. Her first entry in the Thieves World universe is called Ischade, or Ischade, I'm not sure exactly how to say it. The story starts off with a guy named Shexo Kinzen stalking a woman through the maze. The maze is not a place that someone should be at night when they are all alone, especially a woman. So he sees her as a vulnerable target and he plans to do some harm to her. When he gets ready to attack her, something happens and it stops the attack. The next day, Shexo is found dead outside the Vulgar Unicorn. After that, Hans, aka Shadow Spawn, gets curious what happened to someone he considers a colleague or maybe even a friend, and he starts to investigate why Shexo ended up dead outside the Vulgar Unicorn. Captain Vara and Enos Yorl also play roles in the story. Captain Vara is a minstrel, Enos Yorl is a wizard in Sanctuary. They both play significant roles in the story as well, but Hans is the focus. I haven't read much of C.J. Cherryh's work other than the Fated Sun trilogy. That one was written back in the 70s, and I read it probably in the 90s, and it really just bored me to tears. So I wasn't expecting a lot out of this story in this Thieves World anthology. Luckily, I was pretty surprised by it. The story was basically perfect. The pacing was excellent. The action was really entertaining, but it wasn't overwhelming to the whole story. The characters' motivations were believable, and the payoff at the end of the story was excellent and very well written. Looking through the table of contents of the rest of the anthologies in this series, she has about 9 more stories in the series itself, so I'm hoping they're all as good as this one, and I would rate this one a 10 out of 10. The next story is by Robert Lynn Asprin, and it's called A Gift in Parting. It uses characters that haven't been used in Sanctuary before. The main character of the story is a kid named Hort, who is the son of a fisherman named Panet. Hort is getting ready to leave Sanctuary, and he's worried that his dad's going to be unhappy about it because he's not following in his father's footsteps to be a fisherman, but he just doesn't want to be a fisherman. His mom convinces him to go down to the wharf on his last day in Sanctuary and spend some time with his father, go out on the boat with him, just to make the old man happy. When they get out on the water, they discover that there's a mystery with what's happening with some of the fishing traps that the fishermen use, and they start investigating. The story deals with a son's desire to leave behind what his father built. The father doesn't seem to care one way or the other because he understands that not everyone was built to be a fisherman. I like this theme because even though back in medieval times it was probably pretty common for a son to follow in his father's footsteps, that isn't very common nowadays. I think the story was also meant to show that there are other people that live in Sanctuary, fortune tellers, fishermen, bartenders, soldiers, whose lives aren't always just completely normal. They get strange too. With all that said, to me, it was basically a pretty average story, and I would rate it a 6 out of 10. The next story is called The Vivisectionist by Andrew J. Offit. And once again, we get Hans, aka Shadowspawn, in a starring role. The story starts off with Shadowspawn kind of sneaking into the palace because he's supposed to have a meeting with the Prince Governor, Catechithus, and he changes his mind about it and then leaves and comes back the next day. And when he talks to Catechithus, Catechithus says, "Hey, I don't know where Tempest is at. Can you see if you can find him for me?" And because Hans is kind of on a friendly footing with Tempest, he decides to help out and starts looking for Tempest. If you've read Shadow Spawn or Shadow's Pawn, you know why the Prince Governor and Hans have a friendly relationship. And if you've read To Guard the Guardians from previous volumes, then you know exactly where Tempest is at the moment. I like this one because it continues the whole Shadow Spawn Prince Catechithus relationship, and it also adds more to the Shadow Spawn Tempest relationship. About the only thing missing from Hans's character so far is a solid motivation. His only real drive seems to be maintaining the idea and the myth that he is the best thief in Sanctuary. I really liked this story, although there was a little bit of navel-gazing in the very beginning of it, which I can always do without. I would rate this one an 8 out of 10. A quick note on the characters in Thieves World. A lot of characters recur in different stories, but many of them don't really develop much from one story to the next. Hans is a little bit of an exception. He seems to grow with each story a little bit and become motivated to be more of a part of the society and be more of a force for good for the society. Lythan the Magician is another character that does have a little bit more depth to him, but he always seems to be a kind of a side character. The next story was written by Diana L. Paxson. She wrote almost 30 novels between 1982 and 2009. She also co-wrote some of the Avalon novels with Marion Zimmer Bradley. Her first entry in the Thieves World universe is called The Rhinoceros and the Unicorn. In this story, Lalo the Limner is an artist who is a bit down on his luck. His wife's not happy with him and they've had an argument, so he's kind of hanging out at the Vulgar Unicorn, having a drink and kind of relaxing before he goes home. While he's there, a strange man comes up to him, and the man seems to be changing shape as he's talking to him, and the man asks Lalo to draw a picture of him. So Lalo tries, and it doesn't come out very well, but the guy likes it. The mysterious shape-shifting man offers Lalo a commission and tells him what house to go to the next day. If you've read the Thieves World tales up to this point, you'll know that that customer was Enos Yorl, the wizard. Another character that makes a brief appearance in this one is Jarvina of Forgotten Holt, who has a relationship with Enos Yorl. They first appeared together in Sentences of Death, which was the very first story in the Thieves World anthologies. I liked this story, but the commission that he gets after he does the painting the next day seemed kind of obvious to me. Maybe because I've seen other stories similar to it. Maybe this is one of the first, but I doubt it. I don't know. Maybe it's a common trope. I'm not sure. One thing about the payment is that it's a bit of a power that Lalo gets. It leads to the story's main theme, which is basically that the poor people around Sanctuary are much prettier deep down than the rich and powerful will ever be. I think this story could easily be transported to many historical eras and easily be modified slightly and be practically the same story, just with a little fantastical touch if it was placed in like the real world. There isn't a lot of action in the story, but I liked it. It's a more personal story than other stories up to this point. It's easy to see the main character's point of view and understand how he's feeling in each scene of the story. At some points, he feels so bad that he feels like just giving up, and I imagine that a lot of people get that way sometimes, even today. With all that in mind, I'd give this story an 8 out of 10. It's written really well, I like the characters, and it actually has a more upbeat ending than a lot of the other stories that are in these books. The next story is called Then Azyuna Danced by Janet Morris. I have to give you a little bit of background on Azyuna and Vishenka. Vishenka is called Vishenka Tenslayer because at some point he discovered a plot between his 10 brothers and sister Azyuna to kill their parents, Savankala and Sibelia. Now, these are all gods that we're talking about. Vishenka went crazy, he killed all of his brothers, and he was going to kill his sister, but Azyuna did a dance for him to convince her not to kill him, and he basically took her as his concubine. She was willing to do it because he didn't kill her. In the story, Then Azyuna Danced, Molin Torchholder, the high priest in Sanctuary, is basically preparing for something called the Feast of the Ten-Slaying. Part of this presentation is finding someone to play Vishenka in the ceremony where he kills 10 people who represent the 10 brothers that Vishenka killed. The role of Azyuna is played by a slave who will do the dance of the consort, which is basically supposed to be a recreation of the dance that Azyuna did to convince Vishenka not to kill her. This story clarifies bits and pieces of the Vishenka-Azyuna mythology that have been kind of mentioned here and there in some of the previous stories. It also goes heavily into some of the religious ceremony that has been missing from a lot of the previous stories that mention the gods. The story itself is kind of uneven. It's another one of those stories that doesn't want to decide on who the main character is, and I think it suffers a little bit for that. The viewpoint jumps back and forth between Molin Torchholder and the slave Salala, who is going to play the Azyuna role in the ceremony. But in the very last part where Salala is actually the viewpoint character, she seems more like she's just there to almost view the events so that they can be reported to the reader in a certain way. I'd rate this story about a 5 out of 10. It's an enjoyable enough story, and it adds some background to Molin Torchholder that we didn't have before, and that's mainly the fact that he's kind of bitter that he's stuck in Sanctuary and not in the capital of the Rankin Empire, which is a city called Rank. On a side note, this is another story where we see a little bit of inconsistency. In the Gate of the Flying Knives, earlier in the series, Molin Torchholder's house seemed like it was being described as a private estate. In this story, Molin Torchholder actually has kind of an apartment suite in the palace itself. Interestingly enough, there was no editor's note at the beginning of this volume to say, hey, don't worry about the consistencies that you're seeing from one story to the next. The final story in Shadows of Sanctuary is called A Man and His God, and it was written by Janet Morris. So it basically focuses on Tempest with some parts where Hans is the main point of view character, but it also has a couple sections where Zalbar and Catechithus are kind of the viewpoints. I would say that there's kind of a content warning for this one. Even though it's not described explicitly, there is a assault in this, which is not one that I like to imagine. So I won't go any further than that. The story starts off with a bunch of mercenaries camped just outside of Sanctuary, and Tempest is kind of waiting around for Prince Catechithus and someone that's supposed to be showing up from the capital city of Rank and bringing more soldiers with them. Eventually, the prince arrives, and the person coming from Rank turns out to be an old friend of Tempest's, who Tempest is pretty happy to see, apparently. From that point on, the story shoots in multiple directions like a Roman candle firework. It was scattered and hard to follow, and at times I found myself having to reread paragraphs and dialogue just to figure out who was saying what and what was actually going on in the story. There was just too much going on in the story. It felt like it was a condensed novel more than it was a novelette that should have been stuck in an anthology. Certain action was kept off the page, and that's probably because Tempest wasn't directly involved in that action, so there was no reason to show it in detail. Events from previous Tempest-centered stories are addressed, and some actions in this story are natural outcomes of previously happening events from other stories. There's a female character that's strongly tied to Tempest, and she gets introduced, but you don't really quite understand the relationship that they have together, so it's hard to really care that much about the relationship during this story. The friend that came from Rank is a guy named Abarsis, and he brought some soldiers that are called the Stepsons, and these guys were modeled on the Sacred Band, which was actually a real group of warriors way back in history. I don't know how interesting it is. I haven't looked too much into it, but they have their own Wikipedia page, so you can look it up. Just search for Sacred Band on Wikipedia. Starting in 1985, Janet Morris did start writing a bunch of tie-in novels that had Tempest and these Sacred Band characters in them. So I haven't read those yet. I have them over there, but I will probably read them after I finish all of the anthologies in Thieves World. Overall, this story rated about a 5 out of 10. It was interesting enough, but the confusion in the writing and having to reread things just kind of put me off of a higher rating than that. There's an essay at the end of Shadows of Sanctuary, but all it really does is kind of go over some of the influences that caused some of the various aspects of Thieves World and Sanctuary to be created the way they were. It's interesting if you're a writer, but I don't know that just the average reader would really care that much unless they wanted to know what they could look into to find out some of the history that might lie under some of these ideas that are in Thieves World. In the end, I was really kind of disappointed with Shadows of Sanctuary. I really only found 3 of the 8 stories to be all that good. And the other thing was, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, there was a serial killer angle that was kind of hinted at in the introduction story, but that never really came to fruition. There was like a brief mention of it, I think, in one of the stories, but it didn't really go anywhere. Based on the average of all the stories in this one, it still rates a 7 out of 10, surprisingly. I think the main reason that happened is because I rated Ischade by C.J. Cherryh a 10 out of 10, and I think that helped bring up that average. Otherwise, the whole book might have been more like a 6. So there you have it. That's my review of all the stories in Shadows of Sanctuary. I hope you enjoyed these reviews, and maybe you'll want to go out and read the books, and if you do, I hope you enjoy them. Bye for now.